Casting in Unreal Engine is an intimidating subject for beginners, but after watching this video you will know everything you need to about casting. So what is casting really? Basically, it's a way for different classes to communicate with each other, or a way to access a class or object's properties from a different class. Casting can also be converting one variable into another, but in this video, I will focus on the cast to node. There are many uses for casting in Unreal. For example, let's say I wanted to communicate with this cube from my player character class. How could we do that? So I want to change the color of the cube when I press the V key with my player character. That means I need to cast to the cube in order to access its properties and variables. First, we must create the action that we want to occur, in this case to change color, and then trigger this action through the player class. We will have to make it an event so that we can call it from the player class. Otherwise, there is no way to call the event we want to do from a different class. You can also overlap the actor with the onEvent overlap, or hit node, but that requires physical contact with the object, and I will address this later. So now I have created the event that will change the color of the cube. How can we cast to it? If we try to use the cast to cube node, we need an object to reference it to. What this means is essentially that it needs a reference to itself so that we can access it, but since we don't have a reference to it from our player class, we can't use this node. The reason we need to specify the object when we cast is because there can be multiple actors of the same class in the world. If we cast to the cube, how can the game know which cube to cast to? That's why we need an object reference so that we can specify which cube to cast to. The first option is to use the getAllActorsOfClass node and get a copy of the cube. Now we have access to the cube's properties, and we can access pretty much anything from the cube. In this case, we don't need to use the cast to node anymore, but it is possible if you'd like to do that. As you can see, that works fine. I'm just going to make a flip-flop so that I can switch back and forth from the colors. So that works fine with a single actor, but what if we wanted to cast to multiple cubes? Could we use the same method to cast to 2 or more cubes? Well, no, because the getACopy node is only getting one element from all the actors of this class. We could, however, change the actor that we want to affect using the array index. 0 is 1, 1 is 2, and so on. In order to cast to multiple cubes, we need to use the for-each loop. This will cycle through every actor available and execute the event on all of them. That's how you can cast to multiple actors of the same class, but keep in mind, however, that this is performance taxing. If you had 200 of these actors in the game and you wanted to use the for-each loop to cast to all of them, it could slow down your game significantly. Even the getAllActorsOfClass node can be performance taxing when used for multiple actors. So instead of using the getAllActorsOfClass node every time you want to do something, you can promote it to a variable once, and then you will have the reference. That way you only have to tax the hardware once. For example, you could do it when the game starts, or maybe when you reach a certain point in the game. Once you have promoted it to a variable, you can just drag it out from the variable list and use it as you wish. If we delete the getAllActorsOfClass node and compile, you will see that we don't get any errors, but if we try to change color now, it will give us an error in-game. What if we try to cast to the cube when it's not actually in-game? It won't work. That's because the class doesn't technically exist. The code can only recognize stuff that exists in the Unreal Engine world. Every time you get the access none trying to read property error, it means that whatever you tried accessing isn't currently existing. More on that later. We can also cast from the cube to the player. This is even easier since you can always connect a getPlayerCharacter subnode when casting to the player. You can just create an event in the player class and execute it. Just like that, no performance tax or nothing. This is why it's a good idea to use the player character as a middle ground for casting, since it's so much easier and better optimized for performance. So using the player character as a middle ground for casting, how can we do what we did at the beginning of the video, to change the colors of the cube? This requires that we cast from the cube to the player while giving a reference to itself to the player. That way we can access the cube whenever we need to from the player class. It sounds confusing, but bear with me. Essentially what we're going to do is create an event in the player class that we activate from the cube class whilst connecting the cube reference to the event. Start off by creating an event and add input. Add an actor input and give it a name. Promote this to a variable so that we can use it easily. Go back to the cube class and call the event that we just created. Add a reference to self-subnode and connect it to the input. Now we have created a gateway between the two classes. This trick is very useful and can be used with virtually every other class. As you can see though, the event is not showing up. The reason for that is because the input variable we created is the wrong class. Remember when I told you to set it to actor class? Well, in this case it's wrong. There are many types of classes and variables, so it can be difficult to know exactly what variable type to choose. Therefore, I intentionally made it wrong so that we can learn how to find out what variable type we need. If we bring the event back using the getAllActors of class node and try to connect it to the event, you will see an error saying, Actor object reference is not compatible with cube object reference. Right here it tells us that cube object reference is what we need. Let's change it to object and see if that works. Nope, we need it to be cube object reference. That means it needs to be the specific class we're trying to cast to. There we go. Now we just promote it to a variable and then we can call it whenever we need to. It doesn't work. This is because we forgot to compile in the cube event graph. Now it works fine. So this is a good way to cast using events and references to get what you want. Keep in mind, however, that when we need to get an object reference, we must select the specific class that we have created and not an official class. So if we have created an actor called cubeAdupe, this is the variable type we must choose. But it doesn't end there. What if we want to cast between two different actors, maybe two different AI characters? Say we want AI1 to follow AI2. We would need to cast from AI to AI to get a reference. So we could do it the first way by using the getAllActors of class node. That should work fine. But what if we try to use the player character middle ground trick? It's not that you can't use the first method to do this, you can. But there will be certain times where this can be useful. What we would need to do in this case is to cast to the player character from the actor that we want to trigger the event, in this case AI1. Then we need to create an event so that we can input the AI2 reference. This time, we set the variable type to actor. Then we promote it to a variable in the character class. And then we cast from AI2 and set the variable reference. Now we can use the AI2 reference freely and do whatever we want in AI1 by casting to the player. That works perfectly. You can create an entire casting network using this trick, so it's definitely a game changer. Now let's talk about overlap events. This is easier to deal with, but you're limited to having to overlap the actor you want to cast to. It is recommended to use a collision for more accurate results. Here we have a number of events that can be triggered. When we call the overlap event, there are multiple options for us to choose, depending on the type of class you want to overlap with. Since we're using the player, I'll choose the actor. As you can see, we have solved the object issue, so the cast will work fine. Casting here is pretty straightforward, but there are some things to deal with. First of all, what if we wanted to cast to multiple actors? Let's say we want to cast a bullet over to multiple enemies, so that if it overlaps, they will take damage. How could we do that? That is where the cast failed plug comes in. We can connect this to as many actors as we want. What about casting to widgets? It's pretty much the same thing here as we did with actors. If we create two widgets, one called widget 1 and the other widget 2, we can use widget 1 to try to get a variable from widget 2. I will use the getAllWidgets of class node, which is pretty much the same thing as the getAllActors of class node. However, there is one difference that I will address. Let's just create widget 1 and add it to the viewport. If we try to press the button to get the variable info from widget 2, you will notice we get an error. That is because widget 2 doesn't exist in game. Remember the access none error I mentioned earlier? Well, this is how you deal with it. All you need to do is simply add an isValid node before executing the action. Make sure it's the right type. It's a bit harder to find in the widget event graph. So after you have gotten the cast object reference, you must check if it is valid. Valid means whether it is in game or not. If it is valid, it will resume the code. If not, it won't give you an error. So we need to create the widget the same way we did widget 1. Let's see what happens if we try to do it now. No errors, but it didn't work. This is where the difference I was talking about earlier comes in. When we create a widget, we have the option to add it to the viewport. There is a Boolean value here that says top level only. Essentially, this means whether you want the widget to have to be in the viewport to be accessed. If you uncheck it, it only needs to exist in the Unreal Engine world to be accessed, and not in the viewport. You can also cast from a widget to the player character if you wanted to create a HUD or something. You could also cast from a widget to the player character and then to another class, an AI or something. But if you want to use the middle ground trick to cast from widget to widget, you must add it to the viewport. So you might think that since we're using a widget, we should use a class reference instead of an object reference. That can work depending on what you want to pull off. But if you're trying to execute a custom event like we did before, it needs to be an object reference, otherwise the event won't show up. We also can't connect the reference to self, because it is an object reference and not a class reference. So if you're going to use a class reference, you need to choose from the list or connect a class variable. But keep in mind that since we're using widgets, you will need to add it to the viewport, since we can't disable the top level only variable when using the trick here.